Hello again. Today we are looking at chapter 3 in Frog and Toad Are Friends. And I think this is my favorite chapter from this book. So let's get going. This chapter is called A Lost Button. So here we are. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." Notice there is a place where one of his buttons has fallen off. "Don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here is your button," cried Frog. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button?" "I found one." "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button has 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. There's the sparrow with a button in her beak. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," cried Toad. "That button is small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. "I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here is one that I just found." "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button was round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Do you hear all of the descriptive words about buttons? He's talked about the color. He's talked about how many holes are in them. He's talked about whether they were big or small. He's mentioned whether they were thick or thin. And I think he also said, there was one more now, I can't remember. Oh, round or square, right. A lot of different kinds of buttons. Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There, on the floor, he saw his white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." Can you see him jumping up and down and screaming on the first page and then finding his button on the second? Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. What a creative idea. The next day, Toad gave the jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. Wasn't that nice of Toad? In the end, he decided to use all of the buttons that they had found, and then he gave it as a gift to his friend Frog. I'll see you tomorrow.